They rehearsed it once in the morning heat, slow and careful. Tommy went through the motions. Everyone nodded, and the assistant director called it safe. But by mid-afternoon the temperature had climbed even higher. Sweat soaked through shirts. Hands slipped. Muscles tightened. Sugar glass, which was supposed to be brittle, had begun to warp slightly in the heat, tougher than it should have been. Action. Dean Martin grabbed Tommy by the collar and threw him toward the window exactly as Tommy hit it hard. The glass didn't shatter the way it was supposed to. It cracked, then resisted for a split second, just long enough to change everything. Tommy's shoulder took the impact. His body twisted midair. He went through the window wrong. He hit the ground outside the set with a sound that didn't belong in a movie. Not the hollow thud of a stunt. Not the slap of choreography. This was bone and breath and gravity meeting all at once. And Tommy didn't move. For half a second, nobody reacted. Cameras were still rolling. Dust hung in the air. The saloon fight continued inside because that's what everyone was trying to do. Keep going, unless someone yells cut. Dean Martin saw it instantly. He didn't finish the punch. He didn't stay in character. He didn't wait for direction. He turned, looked past the cameras, saw Tommy lying twisted on the ground. One arm at an angle, arms don't bend. And he shouted louder than anyone on that set had ever heard him shout. C-U-T. Cut the damn cameras. The entire set froze. Howard Hawks opened his mouth to protest, instinctively, because time was money and film was burning. But Dean was already moving. He jumped down from the set, ignoring continuity, ignoring blocking, ignoring everything except the man on the ground. "Don't touch him," Dean barked as crew members rushed forward. "Nobody touches him until a doctor gets here." Someone yelled that it was probably fine, that stunts look worse than they are. Dean dropped to his knees beside Tommy anyway. "Tommy," he said, gripping his hand gently. "Hey, buddy, don't try to be a hero." Tommy's face was gray. His lips trembled. "I can't feel my legs," he whispered. Dean felt something cold pass straight through his chest. "Get an ambulance now," Dean snapped. Not asked. Ordered. Not in 5 minutes. Not after the take. Now, an assistant director tried to intervene. "Dean, we can't shut down production." For Dean stood up so fast the man physically stepped back. "If one more camera rolls," Dean said, his voice low and shaking with fury, "I walk. And you can explain to the studio why your picture just lost its star." That was it. Everything stopped. John Wayne had been watching from the edge of the set, arms crossed, saying nothing. He walked over slowly, looked down at Tommy, then looked at Dean. "You did right," Wayne said quietly. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Tommy was rushed to the hospital with a shattered shoulder, fractured ribs, and spinal trauma. He survived, but his stunt career was over. He would never ride, fall, or fight on screen again. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. That night, Dean Martin didn't go back to his trailer. He didn't drink. He didn't laugh it off. He went straight to the production office and demanded to see the contracts for the stunt performers. "What's their coverage?" Dean asked. The studio rep shifted uncomfortably. Me, they're independent contractors." Dean stared at him. "So if they get hurt making us look good, they're on their own." "That's how it works," the man said. Dean slammed his hand on the desk. Not anymore. The next morning, before filming resumed, Dean walked onto the set and gathered every stunt performer and extra together. 30 men stood there, sunburned, sore, used to being ignored. Dean looked at them and said, "Nobody steps in front of a camera today unless the studio guarantees medical coverage, hazard pay, and time off if you're hurt. If they don't agree, we don't shoot." Howard Hawks argued. The studio threatened. Schedules were waved around like weapons. Dean didn't blink. John Wayne stepped beside him. "If Dean doesn't shoot," Wayne said calmly, "neither do I." Silence. By sundown, the studio caved. New safety protocols were written. Medical staff became mandatory on set. Stunt performers received proper insurance coverage. Heat limits were enforced. It wasn't perfect, but it was the beginning of something Hollywood had avoided for decades. Tommy Mitchell never returned to stunt work, but his hospital bills were paid. His family was supported. His daughters stayed fed. Years later, Tommy would say the only reason his life didn't completely fall apart was because one man refused to keep acting when someone was truly hurt. When filming wrapped, John Wayne pulled Dean aside. "I've worked with a lot of tough men," Wayne said. "How tough? But what you did out there, that took more guts than any bar fight we put on film." Dean shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "I just didn't want a man dying so I could finish a scene," he said. Wayne nodded slowly. "That's exactly why you're braver than most." Rio Bravo went on to become a classic. People remember the performances, the lines, the swagger. But on that set, on that day, in the Arizona heat, Dean Martin did something far more important than make a great movie. He reminded Hollywood that the people nobody sees still matter. And once you stop the cameras for that, the industry can never quite go back to pretending they don't. Foster laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "You don't get to make that call, Dean. You're an actor. You hit your marks, say your lines, and let us do our jobs." Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. That was what made it terrifying. "No," he said evenly. "You don't get to pretend this is normal." Foster stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You walk off this set, I'll have the studio replace you by morning. You thingy? Irreplaceable." Dean looked past him, back at Tommy Mitchell lying on the dirt. Medics desperately trying to stabilize his neck while dust blew across his blood-soaked shirt. Then Dean looked Foster straight in the eye. "Try it." The words landed like a gunshot. "You shut this production down," Dean continued. "You insure that man for every medical bill, every surgery, every month he can't work or I walk. Not to my trailer. Not for the day. I walk off this picture." Foster scoffed. "You're bluffing." Dean didn't blink. "I'm not." That's when John Wayne stepped forward. Wayne didn't rush. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He stopped beside Dean, planted his boots in the dirt, and looked at Foster like a man who'd already made up his mind. "He's not bluffing," Wayne said. The production manager hesitated. This isn't." "If Dean doesn't shoot," Wayne cut in, "neither do I." The desert went dead quiet. Two of the biggest stars in the world, standing shoulder to shoulder, staring down a studio man who suddenly realized he had no leverage at all. Foster swallowed. "This isn't how the system works." Dean's voice was still calm. Then the system's broken. The medic called out that Tommy's blood pressure was dropping. Dean turned immediately. "Ride with him," Dean said to the medic. "I'll follow you to the hospital," Foster snapped. "You leave this set. We're done for the day." Dean didn't look back. "Good!" The ambulance door slammed shut. Dean climbed into his car, still wearing his costume, still smeared with fake blood that now felt grotesque. He followed the ambulance all the way to Tucson General, sat in the waiting room with Tommy's wife Sarah when she arrived shaking and sobbing, and stayed there for hours. When the surgeon finally came out and said Tommy would live but might never walk properly again, Dean closed his eyes and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the window shattered. "I'll take care of you," Dean told Sarah quietly. "You and the girl. I promise." And this, Chimmy, it wasn't a performance. Back on set, the studio panicked. Executives flew in overnight. Lawyers arrived before sunrise. By morning, new contracts were drafted. Full medical coverage, long-term compensation, mandatory safety checks signed off by both the stunt coordinator and lead actors, heat restrictions, on-set doctors with authority to stop filming, all because one man refused to keep acting. When Dean returned to the set 2 days later, the atmosphere had changed. Crew members looked at him differently. Stunt performers nodded with something close to reverence, not because he was famous, but because he'd chosen them over the machine. Howard Hawks pulled Dean aside. "You cost the studio a fortune." Dean shrugged. "They'll make it back." John Wayne clapped him on the shoulder. "You did something today that'll outlive this picture." Years later, when stunt unions finally gained real power, old-timers would point back to Rio Bravo and say, "That was the moment things shifted." Not because of a law, not because of a protest, but because Dean Martin saw a man break and refused to let him be treated like debris. Tommy Mitchell never walked the same again, but his daughters grew up, fed, housed, educated. Every Christmas, Dean sent them gifts anonymously. No notes, no credit, just quiet responsibility. And when John Wayne was asked in an interview who the toughest man he'd ever worked with was, people expected the usual answers. Cowboys, Marines, fighters. Wayne smiled and said, "Dean Martin." They laughed. "Wayne, didn't most men play tough when the cameras are on?" he said. "Dean got tough when it cost him something." That's the difference. Dean Martin never talked about that day. He didn't add it to his legend, didn't tell the story at parties. But every time he stepped onto a set after that, people knew something. If someone got hurt, the cameras stopped. Because one time, in 112-degree heat, when nobody else mattered to the studio, Dean Martin decided someone did. Foster wiped his face slowly, buying time. The heat, the ice on him, the silence, it was crushing. This was supposed to be routine. An injured extra, an ambulance, a reset, move on. That's how it had always gone. But now the rules were breaking in real time, and everyone could feel it. "All right," Foster said finally, forcing the words out. "All right. We'll cover the hospital bills. I'll make some calls." Dean didn't move. "Not hospital bills. Everything." Foster blinked. "What? Everything?" Dean repeated calmly. "Ambulance, surgery, rehab, lost wages. If he can't work again, you make sure his family doesn't lose their house. You put it in writing. Today, Foster opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He looked at John Wayne. Wayne didn't blink. He looked at Howard Hawks. Hawks folded his arms. He looked at the crew, at the raised hands, at the faces that suddenly weren't afraid anymore. "I'll need studio approval," Foster muttered. "Then call the studio," Dean said. "We'll wait." And they did. For 40 minutes, no one rolled a camera. No lights were adjusted. No one moved. Dean Martin sat on a wooden crate, hat off, sleeves rolled up, quietly drinking water like this was the most normal thing in the world. John Wayne stood nearby, saying nothing, just being there. The crew stayed. Nobody drifted away. Nobody complained. It was as if the entire set had decided, without saying it out loud, that this was the moment. When Foster finally hung up the phone, his shoulders had slumped. "Warner Brothers will cover all medical expenses related to the incident," he said stiffly. "They'll also provide compensation for lost work time. It'll be handled through legal." Dean stewed. "Good. Now put it in writing. And add this." Foster looked up. "Add what?" "If any crew member is injured on this production due to equipment failure or negligence, the studio covers it. No waivers. No loopholes." "That's not standard," Foster protested weakly. Dean smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It is now." Another long pause. Then Foster nodded. Once. "Fine." The papers were drawn up that afternoon, not just for Tommy Mitchell, but for the entire production. Quietly. No press release. No headlines. The studio wanted it buried. Dean didn't care. He wasn't doing this for credit. Tommy Mitchell survived. His back was badly damaged. His arm shattered, and he never worked stunts again. But his surgeries were paid for. His rehab was paid for. His family didn't lose their home. His daughters stayed in school. Later, Tommy would say the only reason his life didn't fall apart completely was because one man on one set refused to look away. When filming resumed 2 days later, something had changed. The stunt coordinator double-checked everything. The prop master triple-checked. The assistant director slowed things down, and every time a risky setup came up, someone would glance at Dean Martin, not with fear, but with trust. John Wayne pulled Dean aside during a break. "You know you scared the hell out of them," Wayne said. Dean shrugged. "Good." Wayne studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Most men in this town talk tough. You didn't talk. You acted. That's rare." Dean looked out at the set, at the men working under the brutal sun. "I just didn't want to be part of something ugly anymore." Word spread quietly at first. Other sets, other productions. Actors started asking questions. Stuntmen started pushing back. Directors started listening. No one credited Dean Martin publicly. Studios never admitted to anything changed because of him. But things did change. Years later, when a young stunt performer asked John Wayne what Rio Bravo had really been like, Wayne didn't talk about the gunfights, or the dialogue, or the box office. He said, "That was the day I learned Dean Martin wasn't just cool. He had a spine made of steel." Dean Martin never told a story himself. Not in interviews. Not at parties. Not even two friends. But every time someone got hurt on a set after that and wasn't abandoned, part of the reason traced back to one blistering day in Arizona, when an entertainer decided he wasn't going to play along anymore. And that's the thing about real courage. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't pose for applause. It just stands there quietly and says no. That and the word spread quietly, the way the most dangerous truths always do in Hollywood, not through press releases or headlines, but through whispers in studio hallways, over late-night drinks, on sound stages where men with broken fingers and scarred backs finally felt like someone had spoken for them. Dean Martin's name started coming up differently, not just as the guy with the smooth voice or the effortless charm, but as the man who stopped the movie cold and made the studio blink first. Warner Brothers never admitted retaliation, but everyone knew. Scripts that had been perfect for Dean suddenly weren't available. Meetings were postponed, then canceled. Agents stopped calling as often. Dean noticed, of course. He wasn't naive, but he also didn't complain. He'd made peace with the cost the moment he crossed his arms on that set and refused to move. What surprised the studios was how little leverage they actually had. Dean Martin didn't need them the way they thought he did. His records were still selling. His Vegas shows were still selling out. Television wanted him. And more importantly, people trusted him now. Directors trusted him. Crews trusted him. Stuntmen trusted him. When Dean Martin walked onto a set after Rio Bravo, people felt safer. Not because he could protect them physically, but because they knew he wouldn't look the other way. John Wayne kept his word. Any time Dean's name came up in a room where someone tried to quietly poison it, Wayne shut it down. You don't want Dean Martin. He'd say, then you don't want me. And that was the end of the conversation. Howard Hawks backed him too, telling anyone who'd listened that what Dean did wasn't reckless, it was necessary, that it should have happened years earlier. Tommy Mitchell never forgot it. Years later, when asked how he survived losing the career he loved, he'd say, because one man treated me like I mattered. He kept a photo on his wall, not of himself doing stunts, but of the Rio Bravo cast, signed by Dean Martin. On the back, Dean had written, "You deserved better. I'm glad we fixed it." Dean never talked publicly about that day. He never used it as proof of anything. Interviews, if Rio Bravo came up, he'd joke about the heat, about Wayne stealing scenes, about talks being tough as nails. But sometimes, when a stuntman shook his hand a little longer than usual, or a grip nodded at him with a look that said thank you, Dean understood what they were really saying. Years later, a young actor once asked him how he stayed so calm under pressure. Dean thought about the desert heat, the sound of a body hitting dirt, the studio executive talking about lost light, while a man lay broken on the ground. He thought about Sarah Mitchell clutching a hospital bill and then crying with relief. And he said something simple. Being cool isn't about not caring, Dean said. It's about caring enough to stand still when everyone else wants you to move. Rio Bravo went on to become a classic. People remember the performances, the dialogue, the music. But buried inside that film is something you'll never see on screen. A moment when the machine stopped, when money didn't win, when one man decided that his name on the poster meant responsibility, not privilege. Dean Martin didn't change Hollywood overnight, but he cracked something. He proved that power didn't only belong to studios and contracts. Sometimes it belonged to the person willing to say no and mean it. Sometimes it belonged to the guy everyone thought was just there to sing a song and look good. And John Wayne was right. On that day, in that heat, with cameras waiting and careers on the line, Dean Martin didn't just stop a production. He showed Hollywood what courage actually looks like. Within 6 months, what Dean Martin did on the Rio Bravo set had become folklore, not the kind written in newspapers or studio press releases, but the kind whispered between grips over coffee, passed down on remembered by stuntmen whose bodies carried permanent reminders of how disposable they once were. The studios buried the story, but the people who actually built Hollywood didn't forget. To them, Dean Martin stopped being just a star. He became proof that someone at the top could still see the people at the bottom. By 1959, the industry quietly shifted. New insurance requirements began appearing in contracts. Productions were forced to carry real medical coverage, not just for stars, but for stunt performers, day players, and extras. Officially, it was framed as progress. Unofficially, everyone knew where the pressure came from. Rio Bravo had exposed the truth the studios didn't want discussed, and Dean Martin had refused to let it disappear. He never took credit. He never told the story. He didn't need to. The change spoke for itself. Tommy Mitchell stayed in Dean's life from that day forward, not as a symbol, not as a cause, as a person. Every Christmas, Dean received a card from Tommy and Sarah, usually with a photo of their girls scribbled with crayons. And every Christmas, Dean called them no cameras, no audience. Just a man checking in on a family that could have lost everything if he'd looked the other way. When Dean Martin died in 1995, Tommy Mitchell was there. He was 71 by then, walking with a cane, his arm still slightly twisted from that Arizona heat decades earlier. A reporter recognized him and asked what Dean Martin had meant to him. Tommy didn't hesitate. He said, "Dean Martin saved my life. And not just on that set, he saved the life I was able to live afterward. He taught me that you don't have to accept being treated like you expendable just because someone with power says you are." The reporter pushed back, suggesting it must have been easy for a superstar to take that kind of stand. Tommy shook his head. No, it wasn't easy. He risked everything that day. He didn't do it for publicity or legacy. He did it for a guy he didn't know, a guy nobody cared about. That's not a star move. That's a human move. Rio Bravo is remembered as a classic for all the right cinematic reasons. John Wayne, at his peak. Howard Hawks, in full command. Dean Martin, proving he was more than a singer. But there is another story buried beneath the frames, one that never made the trailers or posters. A story about power used the right way, about a moment when profit was challenged by principle. On July 23, 1958, Dean Martin stopped a multi-million-dollar production cold. He stood in brutal desert heat and told the studio executive that no more film would be shot until a broken man was treated like a human being instead of a liability. He risked his career, his reputation, and his future for someone whose name wouldn't appear in the credits. And that decision rippled outward in ways no one could fully measure. Dean Martin didn't see himself as a crusader. He wasn't trying to change Hollywood. He simply refused to pretend he hadn't seen something wrong. And sometimes that's all it takes. One person with enough standing to say no and enough integrity to mean it. The people who were there never forgot. They told the story to their kids, and their kids told it again. Not as gossip, as a lesson. That fame doesn't matter if you don't use it. That power means nothing if it only protects you. That character shows itself in moments when walking away would be easier. Dean Martin sang songs that made people feel less alone. He made movies that lasted generations. But on that day in Arizona, under a sun that nearly killed a man, he did something that mattered more than any performance. He stood still when the machine demanded movement. He spoke when silence was safer. He chose a stranger over his own comfort. That's the Dean Martin story that deserves to survive. Not the martini glass, not the effortless cool. The man who stopped the cameras and said, "This ends now." Because that isn't just courage. That's who he really was.